Let's set the scene. You're new to Ace Combat and have just started playing. You know how to operate your aircraft, read the heads-up display, lock onto enemies and deploy the weapons, and yet it's still not enough. You want to be the next Maverick or Iceman minus the oiled-up volleyball and general homoeroticism, but you just keep getting killed. Want to change that? Then you're in the right place. Welcome to part 3 of Ace Combat 101. This collaboration between Ace Combat Fan, Project Lighthouse and myself is being developed to provide tutelage and information regarding Ace Combat's history, lore and gameplay to those who may be new to the series in light of the release of Ace Combat 7 Skies Unknown. In part 1, I outlined the bare basics of aircraft control, map navigation and the main maneuvers that lay the foundation for flying when in combat. Part 2 saw Ace Combat Fan demonstrate the use of Ace Combat's various types of weaponry and in what scenarios they are deployed, the offensive and defensive capabilities of your aircraft, and what to look for in the heads-up display to help identify and track targets. If you're a complete Ace Combat novice and haven't already caught up on these previous installments, I'd recommend you go back to watch both of them before continuing with this video. Have you seen them yet? Okay, let's continue. Parts 1 and 2 contain all you need to know to get started with any Ace Combat game at lower difficulties. But what if you want to up the ante, and now even the most simple of dogfights end up in you getting missiles up your exhaust? That's what we'll be dissecting here in Part 3. What to think about when preparing to engage airborne enemies, the types of enemy you'll encounter, what, when, how and from where you should shoot, and the skills you can develop to fly circles around enemies when in close. Ace Combat Fan will be guiding you through air-to-ground combat in the next part. All I will be focusing on here and now is dealing with enemies in the air. Click on any of the timestamps below to jump to a particular chapter that interests you. If you're a complete greenhorn, then we'd best start from the beginning. As a quick side note, Part 2 demonstrated that the use of weaponry in Ace Combat is as simple as locking on and pressing the fire button, so you have no need to worry about your radar scanning field or having to uncage sidewinders and things like that. Remember, Ace Combat is not a simulator. I know we've made this point ad nauseum, but sadly it still seems to go over the heads of some folk. Anyway, back to business. As the AI of enemies becomes more aggressive with each increase in the level of difficulty, air-to-air engagements in Ace Combat can eventually devolve into a violent mess of metal and fire that can lead to confusion and, in often cases, eating a missile. But that's only if you let it. In parts 1 and 2, Ace Combat Fan and I were solely using Ace Combat 6 to demonstrate our points. It should be said that 6's gameplay is often slower paced and possessing some different mechanics that don't necessarily make it the best comparison to Ace Combat 7. This includes things like missile locking and agility, the power of the machine gun, and mission structure to name but a few. Because of this, a good amount of the footage for this part will come from what Ace Combat veterans call the Holy Trinity: Ace Combats 4, 5 and 0. The gameplay in these three titles bear greater similarities to how the gameplay in Ace Combat 7 shall feel. It should be said that no two people will play a game the same way. Over time, certain habits and methods are developed, and no amount of tutelage in this video can hope to change that. So for what it's worth, everything you will see here is how I fly, but it's all done in the name of demonstrating different facets involved in Ace Combat dogfighting, and hopefully setting an example to new players as to just what can be done in an Ace Combat game. No matter the game or the player operating it, there are two important notions that lay the foundation for lessons that will appear later in the video, and they relate not to how well one operates the controller, but to their mental acuity. Anticipation and opportunity. The ability to read the situation ahead of you and plan accordingly, but at the same time keep your mind open to unexpected events upon which you can capitalise. It's much like the difference between first and second degree murder. One is premeditated, the other is performed on the fly. Pun totally intended. Being able to grasp both of these in tandem will give you a tangible edge over the competition, and you'll see the ways in which this can be applied in different instances across the video. I have one final thing to add before we begin. Unless stated otherwise, all gameplay footage you will see has been performed on the hardest difficulty. I wouldn't be a very good tutor if I couldn't practice what I preached, right? While Ace Combat Fan gave a general rundown of Ace Combat's weaponry in Part 2, this time I'll take you a little bit deeper into the mechanics of the firepower that you will most commonly use in air-to-air engagements. Any idiot can lock up an enemy and fire a missile, but it's fair to assume that many don't realise that a kill is far from guaranteed. It's better to understand all of this first before jumping into the middle of a huge furball. Trust me, you'll be thanking me for this later. This section will only be focusing on how to best utilise your deployable arsenal and not how to run circles around enemies with your aircraft. In part 1, I gave a rundown on the basic manoeuvres you will be using in combat, but later on I'll introduce more advanced techniques surrounding air combat manoeuvring. I'll touch on the manoeuvrability of missiles in a moment. For now, I just want to talk about optimal firing positions for your standard missiles when in medium to close range combat. I'll touch on other types of missiles a little later. Missiles are most effective when launched from behind an enemy within a certain amount of angular deflection, around about 20 degrees or so. This area can be treated like a cone that extends from the rear of the target. The further away you are, the larger your targeting margin becomes. When fired from within this area, missiles have the highest likelihood of hitting their target. If you get too close, you'll be forced to correct yourself more and more in order to stay behind the enemy. Too far away, and the target might go out of range. When it comes to manoeuvring yourself into this supposed kill zone, use what you learned in part 1 to operate and navigate your aircraft accordingly, changing altitude and heading to bring yourself behind them. If an enemy starts evasive manoeuvres, try your best to keep them within your sights. If the turn is shallow, you may still have some luck in bagging a missile kill. If the turn is too sharp, it's best to stick with them and wait until they have either levelled off or eased their turn. Should you lose visual contact with your target, this arrow on the HUD will let you know which direction you need to turn to find them again. Bear in mind that this only tells you the general location of the target relative to you. It does not guarantee that you will end up behind them. It only means you'll be able to see them in front of you again. If you are in either of the two first-person cameras when placed in a perfect firing position behind an enemy, this shoot indicator will appear. Firing at this time gives you the greatest opportunity to successfully land a hit, but always keep in mind that the enemy may begin evasive manoeuvres, be it once you've locked onto them, or as your missile is making its way towards them. To counter this, try closing the gap by using your throttle to find that certain sweet spot, leaving less time for the target to evade. Speaking of the throttle, this leads neatly into the other half of positioning. Can you do me a quick favour and tell me the name of the first chapter in part 1? Remember it now? That's right, understanding aircraft motion. And what was one of the first things I said? The only part of a plane's forward motion that is in your control is how quickly it happens. Using the air brakes will slow down an aircraft, but not enough to bring it to a complete stop. You see where I'm going with this, right? Your aircraft will always be carrying forward momentum, and you must keep this in mind when either approaching or when already in the midst of enemies. Speaking of enemy aircraft, don't forget that they are also always in motion. This adds an extra layer of thinking to your approach in comparison to stationary ground targets. Not only do you have to be thinking about your own motion, but also that of your adversaries. Look at this example here. I've gone too heavy on the throttle in an attempt to land a guns kill on this enemy ace. As a result, I've overshot, and the hunter has now become the utterly dead. Making sure you get behind the enemy is one half of positioning, but you must always make sure that you don't stuff up your shot because your speed is non-optimal. If you're too fast, you'll either overshoot or not give your missiles enough time to maneuver onto target. Too slow, and you run the risk of your enemy escaping your lock or outrunning your missiles. In combat, you will be relying a lot more on visual cues rather than instrumentation. You don't need to rely on the airspeed indicator to get the best information as to your closing speed relative to the enemy. From long range, you can best gauge your closing speed by watching how fast or slow the distance to target is changing, and then start using visual reference of your target once close enough. Use your throttle and air brake accordingly to bring your speed closer to that of your target. Once you are comfortable with your range, you can then begin manoeuvring yourself into a better firing position. Just remember that airborne enemies have this momentum too. If they're hitting the afterburners to get to you, slamming on the air brakes and jinking can force them to overshoot, leaving them a sitting duck. Don't forget that your aircraft cannot pirouette on the spot. You must keep your speed up in order to maneuver properly. If you slow down too much, you'll stall out, lose control, and end up as easy pickings. Speed, momentum, and energy will all come up again a little bit later in relation to maneuvering while deep in the fight. Standard missiles are the staple weapon of ace combat, and can be considered the primary weapon of the series. After the gun, they have the most ammunition and possess a lot of versatility not only in what they can target, but also in their movement. A common mistake Nuggets make is believing that missiles have to be fired in as straight a line as possible in order to hit the target. In matter of fact, missiles have a very wide cone of movement and can be fired at a target around 15 degrees off the nose of the launching aircraft. If you were to reinforce this agility with the kill zone mentioned in section 1.1, missiles can be launched at targets with a significant deflection off your nose and still successfully hit. This does come with some conditions though. If you think you can fire a missile at an enemy from any angle and get a hit, you're sadly mistaken. Standard missiles will act on the basis of rear aspect targeting, meaning they will always move to strike the exhaust of an aircraft towards which it is launched. If an enemy is angled too steeply, you'll find that the momentum of your missiles, along with their programming to hit the target at its rear, will be too much for their agility to counter, leading to unnecessary misses. This is especially prudent when faced with enemies that are within range for an easy guns kill. Head-on attacks can also be pulled off with standard missiles. As long as both you and the target are on opposite sides of the same plane of attitude, i.e. directly heading for one another with minimal angular deflection, missiles will still be able to track the enemy's exhaust, just from the opposite direction. I'll go deeper into the theory of head-on attacks later in the video. Standard missiles in Ace Combat 6 act somewhat heavier than most other AC titles as evidenced here. They won't turn as sharply and have a much smaller margin for error. To counter this, a mechanic unique to Ace Combat 6 was introduced, and it allows missiles to be launched with greater accuracy. Pointing your aircraft's nose ahead of the flight path of an enemy craft while locked on will display this shoot icon on the HUD. If a missile is launched at this point, a distinctive tone can be heard. This will then change the missile's targeting from rear aspect to all aspect. What this means is that instead of chasing the target's exhaust, the missile will fly a course that leads the target on its flight path and intend to intercept them at a specific point. Trying to fire the gun at an enemy that's outside of standard missile range just makes you look silly, and likewise using a special weapon with a long tracking distance when in very close can become a costly waste of ammo. Standard missiles are best used from between its maximum range to about halfway within gun range. Any closer than that, and you risk missing your shot for reasons stated in sections 1.1a and 1.2. Just remember to wait for the locking tone before firing. As a general rule of thumb, you should be switching to your gun if you can clearly see the target aircraft. When it comes to special weapons, the majority that are designed for anti-air functions will have locking ranges far exceeding standard missiles so as to soften up an approaching enemy force. Because of this, it's better to use them on anything that you cannot lock up with regular munitions. In some cases, these special weapons not only possess a longer range, but they also do not immediately begin tracking and have a noticeable delay between the time they launch and the moment they begin guiding. For example, the XLAA in Ace Combat 6 operates very differently from the similarly named weapons in other titles. Where in the majority of titles it acts the same as an XMAA but with longer range, the XLAA in 6 will fly unguided when deployed, and only a few seconds into its flight will it change course to track its target. Ultimately, the distances from which you use your arsenal are down to personal preference, but I'd suggest sticking to these general guidelines if you're just starting out, and then begin branching out as your confidence increases. We'll expand on this a little in section 3.2. With inexperience comes uncertainty. Uncertainty begets hesitation. Hesitation can lead to you getting shot at when you really don't want it. And the best example of said uncertainty with those new to Ace Combat is hanging around to confirm a kill. Knowing now just how maneuverable your missiles are will help increase your efficiency when in combat. In certain circumstances, it's okay to have trust in your munitions. On lower difficulties, like here on Easy in Ace Combat 0, the AI of enemy aircraft will be slower in responding to missile threats. Use these moments to practice firing at enemies on the very edge of your missile range and turning away before they impact the target. Alternatively, you can also practice on slow-moving targets that fly in a straight line, like bombers or transports. The majority of anti-air special weapons bar the SAAM will also act this way, so as long as you fire at an enemy from relatively close range, you can turn away with more confidence than not that the enemy will meet their end. If you're uncertain, you can slowly disengage and wait for the HUD indication that the enemy has been destroyed. As we should all know by now, the amount of ammunition that aircraft possess in Ace Combat defies every law of physics known to man. It's as if they all have their own vector trap like Jehuti in Zone of the Enders. But the high missile count is due to the higher number of enemies strewn across the map. Running out of ammo isn't something one needs to be worried about on lower difficulties, but once you get towards Expert or Ace difficulty, you'll find that you have less ordnance to dole out on enemies that may suddenly need more hits to take down. That is why, even on lower difficulties, you should get into the habit of being a bit frugal. Using this example here, let's assume you're chasing a slippery adversary. You fire a missile to take them out, but it misses. You could fire a second missile, but that would mean having to use twice as much ammo as is needed to take them down. That next missile could be saved for another target, for instance, or perhaps there might be a mission update with additional enemies later on. So instead of just mindlessly mashing the B or circle button, try compensating for the wasted missile with guns if you're close enough. In games like Ace Combat 4 and some missions of 6, this isn't as big of a deal, as you can cross this dashed return line at any time to rearm and repair. Oh, and just as an aside when it comes to landing and taking off after everything I explained in part 1, it's a nice feeling when you've nailed them, but if it becomes too tricky or just plain boring, you can always press start to skip the landing or takeoff. Don't assume you always have the luxury of rearming though. Ace Combat 5 does not have a return line, and during a long mission like this one in the desert, with even a higher tiered aircraft on Ace difficulty, I've ended up with barely any ammo by the end, even when using it sparingly. This is the kind of situation where being economical with your ammunition helps greatly. Again, you should only ever use as many missiles as is necessary to shoot down your current target, and to effect this methodology properly, one needs to understand the kind of damage specific enemies can take. We'll be looking at that in more depth in section 2.2, but right now I'll only be talking about using ammunition correctly against enemies in these situations. In the majority of cases, you will be relying on your HUD to determine an enemy's current level of damage, be it through indications on the radar, like here in Ace Combat 5, or using this bar at the bottom of the gun camera in Ace Combat 6. However, there are other titles that have no indicator of enemy health at all. It is here that you must get used to being observant of the actions of allies around you. In cases of the former, noting the level of enemy health can allow you to make an informed decision as to how much ordnance to deploy. For example, this enemy requires 2 missiles to kill, but the radar shows it already has low health. Why bother using 2 missiles when 1 will do the job? In other cases where enemy damage is a guessing game, like in Ace Combat 4, you just need to keep your eyes open. In this example, an ally has already landed a hit but hasn't followed up. You can be the good team player and finish them off for them. Again, your ammunition levels don't require as much attention when playing on lower difficulties. Hell, every type of enemy in Ace Combat 4 only needs 1 missile to destroy on very easy difficulty, compared to 2 everywhere else. But as you start increasing the challenge, you'll soon realise that you can't start flinging missiles at everything in sight like they do in Macross. This will put you in the unenviable position of facing off against an enemy Ace squadron with only 5 missiles remaining. Sometimes there will be cases where you shoot down an enemy only for a sitting duck to be right there in front of you, taunting because you have to sit and wait for those missiles to reload. But why wait? You have a gun and special weapons, don't you? In cases where you find grouped enemies, and using the missile agility learned in section 1.2 to your advantage, you can turn your nose on one enemy whilst being locked onto another that's off to the side. While you wait for your missiles to reload after firing, you'll be able to either weaken or destroy the enemy you're actually facing. The following example happened completely spontaneously as I was recording, but it demonstrates the point well. My intention was to wait for this enemy to straighten up so I could get a good missile solution. As they level out, their teammates' momentum carries them right in front of my nose. I fire my missiles and end up inadvertently destroying the untargeted enemy. Now I have to wait for the missiles to reload. If I don't do something, the enemy I was originally after will turn away unscathed. That's why I go straight for a guns kill, and succeed. Remember, you always have more ordnance at your immediate disposal than you might believe. Ace Combat may be an unrealistic arcade series at heart, but as one plays it more and more, those who take a shine to it will realise that there are a lot more small nuances to think about if they're after that elusive S rank. Anybody can fly head-on into the middle of an enemy formation, but the moment one does that, the ensuing battle can become a confusing entanglement that is firstly inefficient, and secondly, potentially dangerous. The anticipation and planning side of aerial combat is what you will be relying on the most, and its uses are incredibly varied. From before you've even taken off, to downing the last enemy before mission completion, you should be thinking 1 or 2 moves ahead. Granted, ace combat isn't chess, but it's always better to have a plan than to go in airbrained. If your experience with ace combat is minimal, it's best that you first try to use the correct and best equipment for the mission at hand. Once you get more and more used to the operation of the aircraft, that's when you can be experimental and wacky like here on Ace Combat Zero, where I've taken on a difficult ace squadron with what is arguably the worst aircraft of the game. In time, you can become like this too. Choosing what you need to deploy with on a mission begins at the briefing. You'll be given a rundown of events leading up to the mission and a brief description of the initial objectives. Afterwards, a tactical map will provide information about the area of operation, enemy types and their numbers, the terrain, and other miscellaneous information such as the time of the operation and the weather. With Ace Combat 7, weather will have a tangible effect on the player aircraft. Lightning will temporarily scramble your HUD, and clouds will help mask both yourself and enemies from radar. Use this time in the briefing to weigh up the size of the enemy force and the assets within it, and make a calculated decision on what hardware you would like to use. Just as Ace Combat fans said in Part 2, you need to make sure the plane you want to take on a mission is suitable for combating the enemies within it. For missions focused on air-to-air engagements, you're better off taking any aircraft designated as a fighter. They are typically faster, more manoeuvrable, and the majority, if not all of their available special weapons will be suited for anti-air combat. Multi-role aircraft aren't normally as agile as fighters, but because they are designed with both anti-air and anti-ground operations in mind, they can be just as well suited for the job. Multi-role aircraft will usually have some kind of anti-air special weapon in their inventory, at least in Ace Combat titles that allow multiple special weapons. I'm looking at you, Ace Combat 5. Attackers are slow and sluggish in comparison and are only meant for ground pounding, but there's nothing actually stopping you from taking one into an air-to-air mission. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Assault Horizon. However, you should only do something ballsy like that when you've had some practice. Don't go assuming that picking any fighter will do the job though. 2 aircraft of vastly different builds may both be called fighters, but they will be much better suited in opposing situations. An aircraft like the MiG-31 Foxhound, for example, is designed for precision interception over long distances. It is incredibly fast and packs a heavy punch, but it handles like treacle in a close-in dogfight due to its size, and will very quickly get swarmed by enemies in a higher difficulty. In a mission where enemy aircraft are spread out, however, it is a perfect choice. On the other side of the spectrum, a smaller fighter like the F-16 may be of a lower tier, but it can still turn faster than a Foxhound could ever dream. Please don't try to go toe-to-toe with enemies in a Nighthawk on your first attempts on Ace difficulty. They will run circles around you and blow your ass out of the sky. You can start doing that once you've improved your general flying skills and want that extra challenge. Lastly, you want to make sure the aircraft you choose has a high air-to-air stat. Most fighters will already have this, but some will have stats nerfed in order to buff others. This DLC Typhoon, for example, has an incredibly low air-to-air stat. Note how long it takes for the diamond-shaped locking cursor to overlap the enemy's targeting box. This delay is further compounded if the aircraft isn't held steady. Now compare that to this A-10, which, contrary to it being an attacker, has a maxed out air-to-air stat. Notice how a missile lock is attained on the targeted enemy even before it has come into the screen. Keeping these statistics in mind will help you choose the correct aircraft for the job. Some would say that it's not the tool but how you use it, but if you're only just starting out, it's better to pick the most optimal tool first, and then test out others once you're comfortable with the best one. As well as the aircraft itself, you can use the briefing to make an informed decision as to what special weapon you may wish to use. If enemies will be spread few and far between across a map, you may want to take more pinpoint weaponry that will snipe them from afar and save you a journey, like the SAAM. On the other hand, situations in which you will be in the heart of the action may require a weapon that will have a greater area of effect like a multi-targeter, or something that you can fire and forget, like the QAAM. Another factor you might not have thought can determine your choice of aircraft is just what you want to achieve by the end of the mission. Do you want to destroy every enemy in sight like a bull in a china shop, or go at it with more surgical precision and only take out the mission critical targets as if you were speedrunning? At the end of a mission, you are shown a debriefing screen that outlines what enemies you destroyed, their points values, the completion time of the mission, and a small graphic recreating the movement of your plane during gameplay. All of these criteria are then generalised by a completion rank, C being the lowest and S being the best. You will be awarded bonus points depending on your rank, which means you will then have more cash to spend on new weapons and aircraft that you have unlocked through playing the campaign. The rank you're aiming for can be the difference between taking, for instance, an aircraft with the precise SAAM special weapon over a multi-targeting XMAA. In theory, every kind of aerial enemy can be engaged in the same manner, but in practice each have their own defining characteristics that ultimately mean you must be diverse in your approaches and weapon deployment. By small or light aircraft, I'm referring more to aerial enemies that pose either little to no threat to you, or may engage you but have very little in the way of armour. The two most common vehicle types to fall into this category are helicopters and targetable missiles. Helicopters across the majority of Ace Combat titles are typically stationary or very slow moving, making them easy kills from the majority of launch angles. The optimal weapon use for these are either one missile, or guns only if close enough. Beware when trying to go for a gun kill on any attack helicopter though, they will fire at you if given an opportunity. There have been many cases in previous Ace Combats where enemy forces deploy cruise missiles as a last-ditch effort once a primary force has been repelled. With the exception of one missile in Ace Combat Assault Horizon, cruise missiles only require one missile to kill. Due to their small size, speed, and the numbers of them typically involved, I wouldn't usually recommend wasting any time in attempting a gun kill. However, these slow-moving cruise missiles in Ace Combat 6 appear to be the one exception to the rule. The aircraft you will be actively fighting against the most are the same as the ones you will be flying. As a result, these are also the aircraft that will most commonly be shooting back at you. They are the most manoeuvrable, and the ones most likely to give you a hard time on higher difficulties. Much like when choosing your own correct aircraft role for the mission, the enemy may very well have different roles in the air at the same time. For instance, an enemy F-22 will be much more dangerous to you in executing its role as a fighter than an attacker class A-10, so keep your eyes peeled for these different roles, and plan out which ones you should try to remove from the big picture first. Unmanned Combat Aerial Vehicles, or UCAVs, can be added to this category too, and they will feature prominently in Ace Combat 7 as standard enemies. UCAVs in Ace Combat operate more like EDI from the movie Stealth than they do the combat drones that militaries utilise in the modern day. Because a human is not aboard the aircraft, they have the ability to perform more extreme manoeuvres. This makes them particularly dangerous on harder difficulties. Heavy aircraft are anything that cannot easily evade you in a dogfight, but whose size makes them more resistant to weaponry. Aircraft in this category can range from bombers and jammers to AWACS platforms and transports. These are typically the easiest type of enemy to destroy after light aircraft, as their armoured bulk is further stymied by their inability to fight back, with one exception that I'll explain in a future section, meaning you can remain close behind them as you give them a polite handout of missiles and guns. Because of their slow speed and general inability to nimbly manoeuvre, heavy aircraft are quite susceptible to missile shots taken from extreme angles. In some Ace Combat titles, this can be up to and including fully perpendicular to their flight path from any angle of elevation. Ace Combat's sci-fi side is most prevalent with the large consortium of supersized weaponry within its universe, and many of them, including in Ace Combat 7, are airborne. Due to their sheer size, it's not outside the minds of Ace Combat familiars to treat superweapons as if they were a ground installation, so don't be too shocked when you see veterans using air-to-ground special weapons on these floating monoliths. Instead of possessing a single objective that needs to be destroyed, these aircraft are laden with smaller destructible assets such as anti-air artillery and engines. These superweapons will take a considerable amount of damage, so it's better to treat each targetable section as an enemy on its own, the destruction of which will ultimately lead to the downfall of the entire craft. Aces are Ace Combat's mini-bosses, so to speak. They are more skillful and aggressive than standard enemies, and are uniquely labelled on the HUD. The most common Ace type a player will encounter is one that is affiliated with the main enemy squadron or squadrons of the campaign. In many titles, extra Aces will appear individually in specific missions on higher difficulties. These Aces in particular will spawn in a unique aircraft, and some may also fly with a certain type of personality, like this A10 that tries to put the player on the back foot by always being on the offensive. Destroying specific aces will unlock their personal paint scheme for the player's use on the same aircraft. Locating and shooting down all named aces in an ace combat title is a perfect pastime for any completionist out there. So, you now know the enemies you'll be encountering on the mission, and you've got the right plane and special weapon to help you get to the end. It's now time to plan your way into the fight from your starting point, and for this, I'd like to do a little practical with you. We'll use Blockade from Ace Combat 4. This simple air-to-air mission has only 3 mission-critical targets in the form of C-17 transport, but it throws in a curveball with 2 E-767 aircraft that have the ability to jam significant portions of the radar with only the smallest of gaps for the player to deduce what enemies are around them. On the approach is where you should begin planning your engagement. The E-767s are here. Taking them out would be the logical step because it will then bring the radar back to full functionality. But at the same time, the first target has 2 escorts directly in front of you. Do you try to clear the radar first, fly straight past the escort and risk being shot at as you pass them, or will you sacrifice your radar and rely solely on your visual scanning and HUD readout while you engage the escorts? Made your decision? Okay, well before we go further, let's jump back in time to Ace Combat 4's first mission, Sitting Duck. The targets are 6 Tu-95 Bear bombers about to drop ordnance on an allied base. They are in a 3x2 formation, ahead of which are 4 fighter escorts. Who do you go for first, the bombers or the escorts? Now that you've had time to think, let's go through these scenarios together and see if your mind is on the correct path. For Blockade, I asked which you would prefer to attack first, the jammers messing with your radar, or the escorts that were simply closer. If you said the former, you'd be putting yourself in danger if you were playing on higher difficulties. The better option is to attack the escorts before engaging the nearby mission-critical C-17. And for Sitting Duck, you had a choice between attacking the targets first, or ignoring the bombers and going straight for the escorts. If you decided on the latter, you would have taken an inefficient path which will inevitably result in you having to turn back around to engage the bombers you chose to ignore. This obviously contradicts what I just said with Blockade, where taking out the escorts was the better option. The reason these tactical calls diverge so much despite their similarities can easily be seen from the radar map. In Blockade, the closest enemies are the ones that pose the biggest threat to you. Since you can visually acquire them, having no radar is but a temporary and mild inconvenience. For Sitting Duck, however, the escorts are flying away from you and are not adequately defending the bombers on your nose. This gives you the necessary window to get some easy kills before you start getting shot at. The higher the difficulty, the more an enemy fighter, multi-role or even attacker is likely to shoot at you, but only when they know you're there. In close proximity engagements, you should make enemies that can shoot at you the first thing to destroy and the second biggest priority altogether after your safety. But wait, there's an additional curveball in the Sitting Duck example. When playing on higher difficulties, bombers have a little trick up their sleeve too. If they have the ability, bombers like Tu-95s and B-52s will utilise tail guns to protect themselves against any hostile that gets too close. Knowing this, along with what we looked at in sections 1.1 and 2.2, means you can attack them from wider angles that take you out of the line of that gunfire. So, you've done everything possible to plan the initial stages of the engagement and have taken out what you could in your initial sweep. But now you're fully merged with the enemy, and they're just as hungry for blood as you. It's time to go to work. But where do you start? Being able to perform loops, Immelmans and barrel rolls is nice and all, but trying to perform them consciously as if they were something to be checked off from a to-do list is too much of a distraction. If you stick to practicing the following moves, you'll be able to gradually hybridize them with the maneuvers I showed you in part 1 and start running circles around your adversaries. In part 1 I described a mechanic called the high G turn, but if you're completely new to Ace Combat and want to try out titles released before 6, you will find them devoid of this mechanic. Obviously, you already know how to turn normally by this point, but your management of throttle, air brake and energy can have varying effects on your turning radius. In this regard, aircraft in the Ace Combat flight model will act similar to road vehicles. The faster you're going, the larger your turning circle, and vice versa when going slow. Similarly, you can think of combat turning in the same manner racing drivers do. slow in, fast out. Combat turning is helpful as both an offensive and defensive measure, but I'll talk about the latter in a few moments. By activating the air brake as you begin to turn, the deceleration will continually tighten your turning circle, quickly bringing your nose to face the direction you need. This can be effective when in close combat, both as a way to quickly evade incoming missiles and to outturn an enemy, and when preparing to engage from afar by bringing your weapons to bear faster. During the braking phase of the turn, enemies will likely be moving further away from you. To cut down on time wasted trying to get them back within range, hit the afterburner once the target is within your frontal hemisphere. Should your aircraft stall during the brake phase, be sure to immediately hit the throttle to regain control. Depending on your situation, you can choose to either disengage and try again, or continue with your original pursuit. There will inevitably be cases where, whilst on an enemy's tail, they will try and shake you off, or you're making your way towards a new target and want to get into a good firing position as soon as possible. As long as you are within the target's rear hemisphere, it will be easier to remain on their tail when they begin evasive moves. Look for which way the enemy aircraft rolls to begin their turn, and try to mimic them. If they pull up, pull along with them. If you can stay on the inside of the enemy's turning circle, you will have the advantage. Even if the turn becomes too steep for your missiles, keeping the top of their fuselage visible presents an ideal target for your machine gun. Throttle control and range during these close-in skirmishes is of great importance. Too slow, and the target's momentum will carry it through a tighter turn than you. Too fast, and you'll overshoot, so try to match their speed as much as possible. If you're too far away, the target may have time to make a 180 and take the fight to you. Too close, and you risk them breaking your lock or escaping your visual cone. This can be countered by switching to target track whenever the enemy is not directly in front of you. High G turns allow your aircraft to pull much faster and tighter turns at the expense of a drastic loss in airspeed. They're basically combat turns on steroids. High G when on the offensive is used in much the same way too. It brings your aircraft's nose around faster. This is advantageous in scenarios where you need to complete a turn before the enemy in order to gain the upper hand in a dogfight. Aircraft with a better stability stat will be able to hold a high G turn for longer before they stall, so be sure to keep this in mind when choosing the right aircraft for a mission, as we discussed in section 2.1. High G turns don't always have to be continuous once activated, and can be stopped by the player at any time. A good use for this method is when trying to keep up with a turning enemy. If you are afraid your aircraft will stall, use high G in small increments to snap the nose up during your turn. This will keep the enemy in your sights without risking your momentum. There will be times when you and an opponent will pass one another head on. More often than not, you won't be in an optimal position for a missile shot, so you will have to turn to engage them after the merge. But this sometimes presents the case of both you and the enemy turning to reacquire at the same time. As a result, you will just end up facing each other head on again. So how can you win this race and get behind them first? Simple. Start turning earlier. You and the enemy will be carrying a lot of speed towards one another, so an overshoot is almost guaranteed. This technique works when merging with the majority of enemy types from an initially unfavourable position. Combining this with a quick or high G turn will place you neatly within a surefire missile shot or a good gun solution. Performing this against an enemy while at slower speeds can be dangerous. Braking earlier may allow the enemy a chance to hit the air brakes, as they do not have as much energy to carry them through, meaning they will still end up behind you after the manoeuvre. So make sure to use this technique only when you are certain that you and the enemy will pass each other. You've probably been able to tell by now that weaponry in ace combat doesn't operate by hit scanning. Anything launched has a certain time between firing and impact based on multiple factors, including the launching aircraft speed, the target speed and heading, and the distance to said target. Sometimes that gap can be the difference between a hit and a miss. As explained in section 1.4, the further the distance from which you shoot, the more time the enemy has to evade. Sometimes this can be alleviated by moving the timing of your missile launch forward, providing you are more confident than not that the enemy will be flying away from you, or at least in a more favourable hit position, by the time the missile reaches them. In this example, an enemy is flying perpendicular to the player aircraft, but is making a turn that will bring them somewhat level towards the front. Instead of waiting until they are flying level to shoot, shoot before their flight path is parallel to yours, and the missile tracking will do the rest. This will save you a small bit of time, but if you were to combine it with fire and forget, you'll already be turning to engage the next enemy long before the one you shot at has gone down. Bear in mind that this is more of a gamble move and won't always pay off. Just keep an eye out for the HUD pop-up informing you the target was destroyed. If it doesn't, you'll know you missed, but you can always return to that enemy later on, or use guns on the next enemy to compensate provided you're close enough, as mentioned in section 1.5. As demonstrated in section 1.1, the arrow on the HUD relays the position of the currently targeted enemy and the quickest direction to turn in order to visually acquire them. This does, however, have one major shortfall. It does not give an indication as to what said enemy is doing as you are turning to look for them. They could be moving to fire at you head on, or they have reversed their position and will shoot straight across your nose in the opposite direction, pulling you into a time-wasting scissors standoff. This can be countered by observing the radar, but that can pose a potentially hazardous distraction, especially at low altitudes. However, there is something that levies all of these downsides. Pretty much all of the footage you've seen so far has demonstrated one particular mechanic that I personally abuse to the ends of the earth, but I do so with good reason. When a target is selected, pressing and holding the triangle or Y button will lock the camera to that enemy. This ability to track the target can be used in any of the 3 camera views and tells the player 3 important pieces of information: the altitude difference between yourself and the enemy, the attitude of your aircraft relative to the enemy's position, and the enemy's heading relative to your position. This means that while you are merged with an enemy, you can see at all times which direction they are facing and where they are turning. By observing their movements, you can change your moves in such a way that you will ultimately end up in the favourable attacking position. But target tracking in this way isn't perfect. Much like looking at the radar, the greatest hazard is at low altitudes. Because the camera is panned away from the space directly in front of your aircraft, don't be surprised if, when tracking a target, you end up eating the side of a canyon. In these situations, a quick look is all you need in order to begin planning your approach. The second negative to target track is that the camera will freely rotate around your aircraft to lock onto the enemy in question. Should the enemy be at 6 o'clock while tracking them, this can sometimes throw off the player's sense of direction, as they will need to remember to flip their roll controls. With practice, however, this disorientating effect can be overcome and forgotten about. So far we've been solely focused on being the aggressor, so what do you do when the enemy starts fighting back? Your survival is, and always should be, your first priority. Never make the destruction of an enemy more important than not becoming a smouldering wreck on the ground. You should start planning defensive maneuvers even before a missile has been launched at you. When the missile lock warning indicator appears, a quick look at the radar should be enough to discern from where the threat is emerging. In a mission with only airborne enemies, the closest contacts on the radar that are pointing towards you should all be considered the aggressor. Sometimes there is only one potential threat, and in knowing this you can begin evading before they have even fired at you. The human eye can saccade from one point of a screen to another, have the brain process the information, and then move back to its original viewing point in as quick as half a second. This is more than enough time while in the middle of a dogfight to acknowledge you have been locked up by an enemy, observe the radar for the potential location of the threat, and begin evasive action. If an attacking aircraft is in your rear hemisphere, start by turning into them. This will immediately steepen your angle to their missile. But don't turn too far, because you may end up head to head with them, and receive an explosive gift to the cockpit. For enemies launching from an area to your front, the best thing to do is turn away from the threat, and put the missile around 60 to 90 degrees to your side. Since the missile will be aiming for your rear, this will once again make your angle too steep for it to hit. If you have been shot at and the radar indicates a missile is likely to hit, you had best pull away from what you're doing and turn hard to evade. If you have high G available, use it to pull a much tighter turn to evade the missile. But don't go too heavy when using high G, because, as shown in part 1, you may stall out the aircraft before escaping danger. In some cases, the best method of evasion is to just not be within missile range. If you feel swarmed, it's okay to fully disengage from a fight to collect yourself. The added advantage to falling back is that most of the enemies will now be behind you. Should you get shot at as you're escaping, you now know that all threats are coming from the rear, and so you can evade them much easier. You can then re-engage with a more clear plan of action. The simplest way to make you as unhittable as possible is to never present a stagnant or predictable profile to the enemy. After all, the hardest enemy to hit is one that never stops moving. Never fly straight when enemies are around you, especially on high difficulties. If you have to straighten up to fire at a target, combine your shot with fire and forget so that you are vulnerable for the least time possible. When the enemy presence around you is thin, there's nothing wrong with flying straight and level. You can use this time to gather your thoughts and start thinking about how you will engage the next group of enemies. Just be sure to double check your radar for any emerging threats. When in the thick of it, however, you won't have much planning time at all. This is where you can use all those fancy maneuvers you learned in Part 1 to flip, roll, and slide around every missile thrown your way. While missile evasion is more of a reactive move, avoiding enemy bullets is a lot more proactive. Erratically maneuvering in this way provides an extra benefit by making you a smaller target to machine gun fire. The reason for turning into missiles fired at you from behind is not just so that the missile must turn tighter to follow, it means the enemy chasing you must also turn to keep you in sight. If you then reverse your turn, you are cutting back across the enemy's nose and forcing them to break their lock. This back and forth act between two combatants is known as a scissors. When combined with the air brake and using target track to see where their nose is pointing, each subsequent turn brings the aggressor in closer, and will either lead to them breaking off or overshooting. Either eventuality brings you breathing space at the minimum, and the advantage in the duel at best. Just be mindful of your speed while performing a scissors. If you stall with the enemy still behind you, you're in for a heap of trouble. Ace Combat Fan already spoke about countermeasures in Part 2. All I want to talk about here is their use in a dogfight, or, to be more specific, why you should learn not to rely on them and trust more in your own skill. In Ace Combat Assault Horizon and Ace Combat 7, flares are at the player's disposal. You should only use these as a last resort against missiles that you are certain you cannot shake off. If you have any doubt in your mind that a missile will hit you, it's more likely than not that you will be able to evade it without having to waste flares. These countermeasures are very limited, so there's no point using them with every missile alert you get. The electronic countermeasures pod can be used both proactively and retroactively. By deploying it just before engaging, you guarantee that you will have the first shot advantage, thus putting the enemy on the defensive. On the other hand, you can always use it to nullify any incoming fire that you might feel is overwhelming you. Now that you know what to look for in the enemy movements, examining existing threats and planning your way through the battle, you can start attuning yourself to certain happenings that are out of your control, but can no less be capitalised upon. In these instances, you may find that taking an uncharacteristic or rash decision can be played to your advantage. It is these impulsive moments that give that extra spike of excitement to the combat. There will be times when you're either chasing an enemy that's giving you trouble, or have just shot one down and the HUD has automatically locked up a new target that is in an unsuitable position relative to you. Don't ever be afraid to disengage from an enemy that is proving to be annoying. You can always go back to them later. Or, if you're lucky, a nearby ally might finish them off for you. You'll sometimes find that a random enemy you hadn't noticed before has suddenly left themselves open to a surprise attack, be it through being in a better firing position, or taking a flight path that means you won't have to turn as much as if you were still following your current target, which is heading the opposite direction. When these stars align, you have the opportunity of a much faster kill. Here, I'm chasing an enemy that's part of an ace squadron, but they are in a very steep turn that is unfavourable to both missiles and guns. As we continue the turn, I've lost visual and will be forced to waste time to reacquire them. However, as I've been turning, I noticed this enemy target box on the HUD. In the few fractions of a second it has taken me to observe it, I can tell two important things. The enemy is in a position that I won't be forced to overshoot, and they're already within missile range. At this point, I decide to change target to this enemy. Almost immediately, I can tell from visual hints and the distance indicator that this enemy is, in fact, flying straight at me after their turn. At this point, I throw caution to the wind and fire 2 missiles. Clean kill. This kind of move won't always pay off though, and sometimes you may end up wasting more time on the new target than you would have with the first. Since your attention up until that moment has been on your current target, you may find that your decision to change has been made based on a misjudgment you've made. This can and will happen to you, but don't let it frustrate. They can be looked upon as learning experiences. Just be sure to keep your mind and eyes open for these sorts of developments. Think of it this way: the enemy in front of you may not always be the next one you destroy. Special weapons are typically used with forethought, but there will be times where you'll find yourself in a situation that does not usually suit the weapon you've picked. Even so, the cards will occasionally stack in your favour. Fire and forget munitions like the QAAM and XMAA are best used in these situations. Weapons that rely on continued guidance from their launching aircraft, like the SAAM, aren't really suitable for rapid deployment due to the speed of enemies defeating the targeting circle. Another reason for deploying like this might be because you have just fired 2 missiles to kill a nearby enemy, and there's a sitting duck lying beyond your gun range just begging to be shot down. Since your missiles haven't reloaded yet, you'd be wasting time waiting for them to come back. In these cases, you can quickly switch out to your special weapon to fill the time void, much like we looked at in section 1.6. Depending on the real-world counterpart after which they are modelled, you may find that missiles and special weapons depart from your aircraft in different ways. Standard missiles, for instance, will always fire their rocket before leaving the aircraft. This launches the missile forward and off its mounting rail without delay. This is called a hot launch. Multi-targeting XMAAs, amongst others, will drop down and clear from the aircraft before their rockets fire. This is referred to as a cold launch. When in the middle of a heaving dogfight, this delay can be the difference between getting a desperate last-second hit or wasting what could be the last special weapon you had before running out. So how can we cut out the delay? Cold launches rely on gravity to pull the missile down and away from the launching aircraft, so if you want to hurry up the missile launch, make gravity work against the weapon. If you invert your aircraft, releasing a missile cold would result in it impacting with the fuselage. In order to avoid this from occurring, special weapons that are designed to launch cold will immediately shoot away if the platform is inverted, thus making their launch hot. This tactic is useful when a rapid fire and forget launch is needed, a good example being when continually under fire while trying to pick off stragglers. Another use for this tactic would be to take out multiple enemies at the same time with a sudden barrage so that they are not alerted to the missiles prematurely, as this would otherwise cause them to scatter and your shot to be wasted. Now we'll follow on from section 1.2 in regards to head-on engagements. Firstly, a quick check of the radar will give a general hint as to which enemies have the intent of making you their next target. These are your best shots at head-on kills. Head-on attacks can be both anticipated and performed opportunistically, it's just a matter of acquisition distance. Some enemies will be long outside your missile range and already barreling towards you. All you need to make sure of in these instances is that you are the first one to shoot the moment you have a missile lock. Bear in mind that the longer the enemy knows you're going for them, the better chance they have to move away. Like the example in section 3.1, there may be enemies nearby that either you have chosen to attack next, or towards which the game has already switched, and they are already heading for you. Sometimes there is no time to think, only act. An advantage of this kind of head-on approach when on the offensive is the massive reduction in time for the enemy to evade. The largest downside is that the margin for error is much smaller. Even when all the variables have fallen into place, there is still a good possibility that the shot will miss. Just remember that if the enemy is in your missile range, you will also be in theirs, so don't be shocked if the guy you're facing decides to try their luck too. Just remember that you don't always have to kill an enemy on the first or even second pass. Don't look at the pursuit of an enemy as a matter of pride, where you feel you must down them on the first attempt. Instead, consider it a matter of method. Don't forget that the enemy has limited damage tolerance too, albeit much smaller than yours. There is absolutely nothing stopping you from whittling the enemy down bit by bit with opportunistic bursts as they fly rapidly across your nose. Obviously, missiles can't lock on or track quick enough to catch an enemy in most of these situations, but your machine gun can. That's why I call these little pot shots gun bites. Even when gun ammo is finite on higher difficulties, you still have plenty of rounds to throw at unsuspecting enemies. This is best used in situations where quick switching will not lock up an enemy before they vanish again. Since the enemy in question is likely to fly across your nose at speed, try pre-firing the gun so that they fly straight through a stream of rounds. Due to the power of the machine gun in Ace Combat 6, gun bites can often net you a quick kill. On any other title, the weaker gun will still help to nip away at the enemy's health until they either can't take any more damage, or you line up a good missile shot to finish them off. I know this video has dragged on a bit, but I had a lot to say in the field of air-to-air gameplay in Ace Combat. No doubt you've probably forgotten half of it already, so to finish, how about a few quick do's and don'ts that you should try to live by? Do consider every enemy that is nearby, and remove the ones that can do you the most harm first. Don't put the possibility of a kill before the certainty of your safety. Do use ammunition sparingly, and try to get into the habit of using guns to compensate for trashed missile shots. Don't fly straight when in the middle of combat unless you're certain your surroundings are clear. Do use your radar to determine the source of your biggest threat when locked up. Don't waste countermeasures on threats you can easily evade through basic maneuvers. Do be mindful of your altitude when engaged, and keep an eye out for any terrain obstacles if in low-level dogfights. Don't become target fixated. Switch to another enemy if one is giving you difficulty. Do be diverse in your weapon usage. You're allowed to lean on your gun and special weapons too. Don't take an unsuitable aircraft as a challenge until you've had enough practice. And most importantly of all, do keep practicing, and have fun while you're at it. And so this part comes to an end. I hope you found this section on aerial combat concise and informative, even if there has been a lot to take in. Since Ace Combat 7 is open to a much larger and more reachable audience than any previous game in the series, new players are an inevitability, and some of us long-timers wanted to pull together our collective knowledge to provide what help we could. Outside of these videos, Project Lighthouse are contributing to Ace Combat 101 with numerous articles about the history of the Ace Combat series and the lore within it. Go and check out their website if you're interested. Alternatively, try visiting the Ace Combat wiki as well, run by Sly Cooperfan 1. Stay on the lookout for Part 4, in which Ace Combat Fan will teach you everything you need to know about air-to-ground gameplay, so subscribe to him if you aren't already. If you stick with us and keep practicing, you'll be diving into the fireworks like the best of them in no time. Farewell, buddy.